Hello, I'm David Myers, a faculty member in the UCLA History Department and the UCLA Leve Center for Jewish Studies. And on behalf of the Leve Center, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which features Dr. Jason Lustig and his recent work, A Time to Gather, Archives and the Control of Jewish Culture, which you can purchase through Oxford University Press or wherever books are sold. I encourage you to do so because this is really an exceptional book. Well-researched, beautifully written, and hard-hitting. Indeed, a book that charts new pathways of understanding in modern Jewish history. I'm delighted to welcome back to UCLA, albeit virtually, Jason, who is a lecturer and Israel Institute teaching fellow at the Schusterman Center for Jewish Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. In addition to writing A Time to Gather and a number of other significant articles, Jason is the creator and host of the Jewish History Matters podcast, which can be found online at jewishhistory.fm. Today's event is a homecoming of sorts for Jason, since he received his PhD at UCLA in the History Department. He has also been a Harry Starr Fellow in Judaica at Harvard University's Center for Jewish Studies and a Gerald Westheimer Early Career Fellow at the Leo Baeck Institute in New York. So, Jason, welcome back to UCLA, and thanks for participating in the discussion.
Thank you so much, David. It really is a pleasure to be back, albeit virtually.
Great. Let's jump right in. Tell us, what is so important and intriguing about the study of archives?
Archives are in many ways the kind of a place where historians go and find amazing things. And it's in many ways, without getting too poetic about it, archives are really where one can go to find history, or at least that's the way that it seems. And I think that many historians and many scholars think about archives in this way as this very fertile ground for the production and the understanding of new approaches to history. And in many ways, I think that the archives that we have at our disposal, the really rich material of history, and of Jewish history in particular, has enabled us to do amazing things over the past generations. But I think at the same time, also what is very exciting and interesting about archives is that archives are also these places of struggle over really who gets to own or control Jewish culture, which is really what the book is about. And so the book is aiming to take a critical perspective to look at these archives to understand both how it is that we have received such a rich historical tradition in terms of understanding Jewish history, but also to understand the ways in which people have been constantly fighting over where these archives should be, what they should contain, and what this is also going to represent about not just about the past, but also about the future.
Great. So let's delve a bit more into the book, which is called A Time to Gather, Archives and the Control of Jewish Culture, which is a title, the first part of which, that is drawn from the response of the Anglo-Jewish scholar Cecil Roth to the American-born president of the Hebrew University, Rabbi Judah Magnus, in 1945. And Roth said, "This is clearly a time to gather," that's say in the wake of the Holocaust, with a decimated European Jewish map before him, not the reverse. So can you set the stage for us? What was the context in which Roth made that statement, and what were the stakes at hand?
Yeah, thanks, David. This is, in many ways, one of these historical episodes that when I found the letter in the archive, you see it and you're like, aha, this is it. This is where you understand the way in which the people at the time clearly saw the stakes of what was taking place in the immediate post-war era. The specific story here is that that in the course of the Nazi era, the Nazis notoriously looted and stole and plundered Jewish libraries and archives and all sorts of cultural materials from Jews throughout Europe, which led to the situation in the immediate post-war era where people were trying to figure out what to do with all of these things. You know, should they be returned to Jews in Europe in some fashion? Should they be sent to new places where they could be put to use by Jews who were living elsewhere? And so in 1945, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, and this letter actually from Roth to Magnus actually is from August of 45, so right after the war has ended, and what is happening here is that Magnus was involved in a group at the Hebrew University, what was known as the Otzrot Hagolah, or the Treasures of the Diaspora, which was seeking to bring historical and cultural materials to Jerusalem. And Magnus had asked that these archives of the Jews of Italy, where of course Cecil Roth, being a scholar of Italian Jewry, had a deep interest in them. So Magnus is asking the Americans essentially to facilitate this process of sending these archives to the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And when Roth finds out about it, he is essentially incensed. And we can understand, I think, that Roth is a friend of the Hebrew University. Cecil Roth's brother actually was a professor at Hebrew University at the time. So he has a deep connection, Cecil Roth, with the Hebrew University and is a friend of the university. And yet, Roth is articulating this idea that these materials should not go to Jerusalem. And so his use of the term, of the phrase, "this is a time to gather," and not the reverse, I think is really telling, because it indicates both the kind of general sense that in the aftermath of the Holocaust, that this was a moment when Jews should be gathering together the cultural and material resources, and also just the people of the Jews, right? We talk about the scattering of the displaced persons and Holocaust survivors in this time as well. And so there's a sense that Jews should be bringing together cultural resources. But what we see in this instance is that Roth is suggesting that what Magnus sees as gathering things to Jerusalem is actually a kind of scattering. And so we can see this shared impulse on the one hand, but also the ways in which, to one person scattering kind of, to one person gathering is kind of scattering and vice versa. What?
In what sense was that scattering? In what sense was the Otzrot Hagolah project at the Hebrew University, in what sense could that be deemed scattering rather than gathering?
Yes. So the Otzrot Hagolah project, which was not just concerned with archives, but also with library books and all sorts of other things as well, is certainly a project of gathering in and of itself, right? And the roots of that particular project, come from sort of series of ideas within Zionism known as kinus, which is literally means to gather. But I think that what's important to see here is how Cecil Roth is articulating the idea that one person's gathering together is actually a process of moving things to new places, and that would end up scattering these materials from their original location where they were originated. And that, I think, is really where you see, again, the stakes of this that develop in the post-war era, coming out of the time of the Nazis and the great looting, the tremendous looting of Jewish cultural materials. The question is, well, what do we do with it now? How do we put these cultural riches, which have been stolen and we're now in all sorts of new places? They were scattered across Europe, just in the same way as the Holocaust survivors themselves have been. What do we do with them in the aftermath, in the process of rebuilding Jewish life? And so the question of creating archives and bringing together the materials of Jewish history, is very much within this broader context, but different people had different visions of what a post-Holocaust, a post-war Jewish world, Jewish culture is going to look like. And so these different regimes of gathering represented the differing visions of Jewish life post-Holocaust.
Right. So you make clear in your book that there are really quite different ideological, political, and moral stakes involved in the various projects of archival creation that you chronicle. And I want to get to them, and we will, because that's really what stands at the center of the book. Archives is a reflection of competing ideological, political, cultural, and even moral visions of the world, certainly of the Jewish world. But I want to go back to your opening remarks and just sort of try and understand better what drew you to the study of archives. So you are an historian. who, like many historians, makes use of archives. And you do so very richly and effectively. You just brought to our attention a letter from an archive from the summer of 1945. But what drew you to this kind of meta reflection on the archive? Not just using the archive, but actually studying the archive as a repository, not just of documents, but of distinct cultural, political, ideological visions.
Yeah, so I have long been drawn to archives for all the reasons that we've talked about so far. But I think also that I increasingly came to understand the way that archives have actually shaped to understand the past to begin with. That the archives provide the framework through which we are able to understand the past in the very first place. Because history is essentially unknowable, we can't hop in a time machine and go back and see it for ourselves. The way in which we access the past is through the paradigms which are created by the archives themselves. And this is both a question of what people choose to collect and what they decide not to focus on. It's also a question of what they bring together in one place, where it goes, who gets to be in charge of it, and so on and so forth. And so what really drew me to, as you put it, the sort of the meta approach to thinking about archives was initially kind of an interest in understanding how the field of Jewish studies came to be, and how these archives were shaped by the broader forces of their own time, not just of the historical time periods which they were documenting and describing. And then as I got further and further into this project, it also became very clear to me that the archives were very much also about the future. And this is very exciting. I think as a historian, we usually talk about the past, right? That's what we do as historians. But the archives offer us a window into thinking about how people at particular points in time came to think about the possibilities of the future, and that's really where I find archives to be so tremendously dramatic and so tremendously interesting, which is that archives are a way for us to understand broad issues in Jewish history beyond the specific documents that are held in the archives. And then in addition to that, I think that it offers us a way to think about the broader society in which we live today. We live in an information society, and I think that that as we understand more and more the way that information, who has access to it, who gets to determine how it's structured, who has access, I already said who has access to it, right? All of these different things are about power. And so we can see this playing out in Jewish history as well. So it's not just about the digital age, but we see so many of these issues playing out beforehand as well.
Okay. You depict archives as sites, as repositories of power, and very much the power of shaping the conceptual contours of the archive is associated with the state. And this leads me to ask you whether archives are modern inventions of the modern nation state. What's the history of archives? Is the archive an invention of modernity and sort of the modern post-Westphalian notion of the nation state, or is there a longer history that we need to attend to?
Yeah. So in a certain sense, archives have always been with us. When we look at the broadest scope of human history, the process of writing things down, of recording things, whether it's recording history or recording the number of bales of hay, that were harvested, right? These are aspects of what it means to construct a human society. And when you go back to the ancient world, there's tremendous evidence of archives. Of clay tablet archives and so on and so forth. And throughout history, people have kept records of all different kinds of things. So in a certain sense, archives are something that traverse the entire span of human history, and that in many ways allow us to write that history to begin with. And this is, in some respects, kind of what Jacques Derrida writes about when he refers to the ancient origins of even the terminology of the archive. But I also think that there's something distinctively modern about the way that archives have developed over the past few centuries. You pointed to the state for instance. And in many respects, I think that that the kinds of archives that we see developing, from the early modern period forward, are deeply tied in with the growing abilities of the centralized state to manage its affairs. And I think it's important for us to recognize that that archives also, they do go beyond the state, but in terms of the way in which the archival profession developed over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, there was long this understanding that the key archives that they were dealing with were going to be state archives on the one hand, and also the state archives offered, at least for Jews, they offered a point of reference, a very important point of reference, where you look, for instance, at the formation of the Gesamtarchiv der Deutschen Juden, which was the central archive of the German Jews based in Berlin from 1903 to 1943. They are looking to the German state archives for kind of an inspiration. And then later on, you see, for instance, the creation of archives in Jerusalem, right? And some of the archives I'm writing about in the book, they are not so much the state archives, but it has to do with the connection between gathering archives and having the powers of a state. There is a sense, particularly by the figure of Alex Bein, who was the first Israeli state archivist, and the director of the Central Zionist Archives, and who led many of the archiving collecting projects in Europe in the 50s and beyond, that gathering archives to Jerusalem was a representation of the idea of the David, this very familiar, it's very familiar to you, the idea of the Zionist return to history. That basically by having state archives, it's a manifestation of the Jews' return to the stage of history and having the agency of state power. And so there's much more to dive into here, but I think just to wrap up, I think that when you ask about what is the relationship between archives and the state, well, archives do go beyond the state, but the state's power, so to speak, is so often bound up with the ability to document and to surveil and to use that material, but also to remove things from archives, right? So like archives and state power have a very deep and close relationship. And then I think that when you look at Jewish history in modern times, Jews have a varied and complex relationship with the state. And so we can see the history of archives as offering us a way to understand this history of Jews and the state on the one hand, and also what it means for Jews in the context of Jewish nationalism to increasingly aspire to the creation of a state, and then what that looks like once the state of Israel is established in 1948.
Right. So what you're suggesting is that the work of the archive, of creating, maintaining, collecting, disseminating documents therein, all of that work is in some sense political in a very direct sense, oftentimes associated with the state, or in the case of the Jews, with the attempt to create quasi-state-like institutions that call attention to and evoke and even imitate actual state archival institutions. But there's another sense in which archiving is a political act, and that really draws from your reliance on the work of Hans-Jürg Reinberger, who suggests that it's not so much that scholars discover objects of their study, they create or invent them. They are the epistemic things that scholars create. And you rely heavily on Reinberger to suggest that it is archivists who create archives, archival planners who create archives. It is not the documents themselves, the collection thereof, that creates the archive. There are conceptual and indeed ideological factors involved in sort of the creation of an archive that perhaps we might not assume. It's a kind of, I should say, there seems to be a kind of postmodern skepticism towards the claims of archivists that they're just merely collecting documents. You, in fact, say that archive making was just as much about forging the future as about preserving the past. So I wonder if you can talk about this kind of the constructed nature of the archive, which at some level is an act of cultural politics, sometimes even just outright politics. And juxtapose that to a much more conventional understanding of the archive as sort of the repository of all documents relevant to a particular subject.
Right, right. So there certainly is like a deep postmodern sort of tendency within the book and the entire approach to archives. But it's not just me, I want to emphasize. I think that when you look at the critical approach to archives, which has been developing for a number of years in the humanities and social sciences, things like postmodernism are really crucial as people, as scholars increasingly are understanding the constructedness of all things to begin with. In the case of Reinberger, and his sort of conceptualization of what he calls epistemic things, I'll explain very briefly, what he's talking about here. Reinberger is actually writing mostly about the physical sciences, the natural sciences, and talking about how the objects which scientists study in the laboratory are not just things that they find out in nature, the things that exist on their own, but that they are classified, they are categorized, both in terms of how they relate to each other, but also as evidence to begin with. And so one can talk about how proteins are sort of synthesized in a test tube. How you don't just study a type of an animal, you have to find it and bring it in. Right? You can't just, there are all different ways in which Reinberger is engaging with this question of how evidence is constructed. And in the case of archives, I think that there is a tendency, sometimes among scholars, definitely among the public, to assume that history is just there, right? That all of these things just kind of ended up there in the first place. And when we think about archives as epistemic things, archival institutions, and also archival materials. There's a story here, which is that there are multiple processes through which the materials of the past are entering into the possibility to be studied in the very first place, both in terms of the ways in which archivists and collectors are going out and gathering these materials and putting them inside of an institution or a place where they can be preserved, right? And in addition, how scholars who are working through materials in the archive are going to come across things and start to take notes on them. That process of taking a note on something makes a object something that we are capable of studying in the first place. And so I think that when you look at the political side of the archives, it is very much about who has the ability to construct the possibilities for the study of the past in the very first place. This both has to do with who they let into the archives. It also has to do with, like all sorts of other things, and there's an entire kind of philosophical aspect to this as well. But by articulating the ways in which archives are another kind of epistemic thing, I think, can have a better understanding of the way, both for Jewish history, but also beyond it as well, archives are a thing, which are constructed. The documents of the past don't just appear out of the past, but they have a pathway to get to us, and then also to become something that we have the ability to study in the very first place.
Okay, so let's talk about how those pathways were created. There are three main protagonists, as it were, in your book. I often think of it as a kind of collective biography, a prosopography. They are the Gesamtarchiv in Berlin, the Jewish Historical General Archive, later the Central Archive for the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem, and the American Jewish Archive in Cincinnati, Ohio. So each of these three was rooted in its own historical and cultural setting. Each had its own set of guiding inspirations, aspirations, leaders. Each had its own conception of what an archive should be. Each was animated by a different ideological vision. Can you explain, maybe in serial fashion, how each of them came into being, and on what organizational and ideological bases they were created? Because as we know from the book, as you illustrate so clearly, there are at least three models of organizational logic on which they rested: totality, centralization, and omniterritoriality, which you will explain for us. And each rested on its own distinct vision of a Jewish future. It rested on its own ideological vision of the Jewish present and future. So a lot to unpack there, but maybe we can begin in serial fashion in Germany and make our way up so that we see both the serial connections, but also the stark differences amongst these three visions.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, David. I think that when I look at this set of archives, the Gesamtarchiv in Berlin, the Jewish Historical General Archives in Jerusalem, what's now the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People, and the American Jewish Archives, which is in Cincinnati, somewhat curiously, and we can talk about the politics of the geography there, is these represent 3 points on a triangle of a network of Jewish archives. That again, it begins with these three, but we can see the strands of this archival network that branch out from them, and that connect Jewish collecting activities together into this broad process of what I've called a time to gather. This sense throughout the 20th century that there was a need to bring together the forces and the resources of Jewish culture, both before the Holocaust and also afterwards. And so when I look at these three archives, they represent different aspects of this impulse to gather and how they come into contact with each other and also into conflict with one another. So so if we start with the Gesamtarchiv, I suppose, so this was an archive that was put together in the first years of the 20th century by a couple of major German Jewish cultural and communal organizations, with the aim of bringing together the communal archives, the archives of the different Jewish communities within, at the time, Imperial Germany. And the archive was under the direction initially of a figure, a scholar by the name of Eugen Teubler, who he was just a young scholar, just finished his PhD at the time, and he comes in to lead this archive and help to bring together the materials of German Jewry to Berlin. And this archive is closely connected with the state of with the German state itself, and the vision of totality and of centralization, which manifests itself in the Gesamtarchiv, is a mirror of the of Teubler and also his colleagues, including figures like Georg Hurlitz, who was his assistant director, later on the founder of the Central Zionist Archives, later on Jakob Jakobson, who succeeded Teubler. These are all Jews, alongside many other figures who are involved with this archive. These are all individuals who are deeply connected with a sense of Germanness, right? And that Jews in Germany had like a kind of a patriotic duty of one kind or another. And so for them, gathering together these materials was both a kind of a project for the creation of a historical resource for research, but also it was a manifestation of their attachment to Germany, that they wanted all these things brought to a centralized location in Berlin. And so you see, for instance, conflict that emerges between the leaders of the Gesamtarchiv in Berlin and some archival and cultural figures in Alsace-Lorraine. And so I think that, in some respects, this is not at all surprising, because we know a great deal about the cultural politics of centralization in Imperial Germany and the relationship between the German imperial idea and the territory which had been taken from France in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. But there's this question: to what extent are communities actually going to send their materials to a centralized institution in Berlin? And this archive, in many ways, sets the stage for what's going to happen after the war. The vision of totalization, of gathering everything that Teubler and his colleagues and successors develop, offers a paradigm for many of the other Jewish archival activities, and again, not just in Jerusalem and Cincinnati, but for instance, at the American Jewish Historical Society, you have leaders there who are talking about trying to create an archive, a kind of a Gesamtarchiv of American Jewish history, for instance. And so you see the ways in which Jewish archival leaders and scholars are looking towards the Gesamtarchiv as an example of what a professional Jewish archive might look like. And then, of course, the Gesamtarchiv has the whole story with the Nazis themselves, in as much as under the thumb of the Nazi regime, the Gesamtarchiv, like many German Jewish communal institutions, comes under the the control, at first indirectly and then more and more directly, of the Nazi Party. And so the Gesamtarchiv gets kind of taken over by the Nazis, who use the Gesamtarchiv essentially as a tool to help control the Jewish communities by having all of this historical materials on the Jews. This begins before Kristallnacht and then accelerates afterwards. Eventually, all the materials are confiscated and stolen by the Nazis. So that's kind of the story there. And so the Gesamtarchiv also becomes this prize that Jewish archival leaders after the Holocaust are going to try to get their hands on as they're trying to rebuild the archival edifice of Jewish history. Now, alongside the Gesamtarchiv, the two other major players, which I really see as a very closely aligned pair, but also that have very stark differences between them, where we can do some really interesting comparisons and contrasts between different archival approaches, are the Jewish Historical General Archives, which were initially established in 1939 in Jerusalem and then officially opened to the public in 1947 after the war. And the American Jewish Archives, which were also established in 1947 at Hebrew Union College in Cincinnati. And so the Jewish Historical General Archives is this project to gather together the materials of Jewish life in the diaspora and bring them to Jerusalem. And in the 1950s, under the leadership of Yosef Meisel, who was the director of the archive at the time, but also other figures, including I mentioned Alex Bein, for instance, they send people repeatedly to Europe to try to acquire Jewish archival materials, which had been looted by the Nazis or otherwise, and to try to bring as much of it as possible to Jerusalem. And this project, which they termed the Kibbutz Galuyot, or the ingathering of the exiles of the past, was an effort to try to bring together basically as much as they could in a process that was parallel, that they saw close parallels between the ingathering of this historical material with the mass migration of Jews to the newly established state. And so it's part of a cultural Zionist vision that creating a state is not just enough to fulfill the Zionist program, but that one should also construct a Jewish culture. It also has to do with a sense of the hegemony, so to speak, or at least the theoretical hegemony of the new Israeli state over Jewish culture and over Jews around the world. That basically all of these Jewish archives should come to the newly established state. But of course, the reality is that Israel has a very small Jewish population in 1948 and remains a smaller Jewish community than the United States into the 21st century. And so what you see is that the creation of these archives and bringing them to Jerusalem, through restitution processes and all sorts of other things, are a part of the state of Israel essentially trying to manifest itself as a Jewish state. Right? What does it mean for Israel to be a Jewish state? Well, one of the things that it can mean is that they have the historical materials of the Jewish past. And so in this whole process, the Israeli archivists are articulating a vision that the state of Israel is in some respect a kind of a successor to European Jewry by gathering these materials that used to be part of European Jewish communities. And then in addition, we can speak about the American Jewish Archive.
Before we do that, I want to just pause and sort of point out a kind of a divergence, I suppose, a tension between forces of continuity and forces of change. So you have described for us not just two archives, but a lineage of Jewish archivists, almost all of whom you've mentioned are German. And there's a German tradition of archival labor from which this cohort or set of generations of Jewish archivists emerged out of. And therein lies the continuity, sort of a shared vision of the centrality of the archive to the lifeblood of the collective. But there were different ideological perspectives animating different generations of German Jewish archivists. Was there a different concept of what the archive should be between Germany and Palestine, later the State of Israel? Did these sort of same German Jewish archivists actually adhere to differing or the same conception of what the archive should be?
That's a very good question. In a lot of respects, is very similar. I think that as you mentioned, many of the people are the same, right? I mentioned the figure of Georg Hurlitz, for instance, who was an assistant director at the Gesamtarchiv, later on forms the Zionist archives in Berlin, and then transfers them to Jerusalem in the fall of 1933. And so Hurlitz, is a kind of a major figure here. He writes in 1964. He writes an essay in the Leo Baeck Institute yearbook about his teacher Eugen Teubler, his mentor Eugen Teubler, in which he makes this kind of suggestion that Teubler actually envisioned this kind of central archive for the history of the Jewish people already back in the 1910s, right? So there's this sense that the German Jewish archivists who immigrate to Palestine in the 30s, and later on to the State of Israel, they believe and they see themselves as carrying forward the vision of the Gesamtarchiv on a much larger scale. Now, I think one of the important differences that we can see here, and this also potentially leads us into thinking about the American Jewish archives as well, is that the vision of Eugen Teubler of creating a central archive of the German Jews it's grand in its scale of thinking about Germany, but it's focused on Germany in particular. And Teubler actually wrote an essay in 1919 or 1920 where he talked about this idea that basically every single country should have its own Gesamtarchiv of the Jews. Like there should be a Gesamtarchiv of the Jews in France, a Gesamtarchiv of the Jews in Great Britain, and so on and so forth. So his idea is about archives that are tied with the specific states in which Jews are living, whereas the archivists in Jerusalem have this broader vision of an archive of all of the Jews everywhere around the world. And that, I think, is one of the key differences, which is that if we think about this question of archives and hegemony, yes, in some ways it's the same question. The relationship between the Jews in Berlin and the Jews in Alsace and Lorraine, right? And the question of the relationship between Jews in the State of Israel and Jews in the diaspora is the question of who has primacy, who has cultural hegemony over them. But the difference is that within early 20th century Germany, this is limited to the state of Germany itself, whereas the archivists in Jerusalem in the 1940s and 50s and beyond are envisioning this idea of the archive as representative of the cultural leadership of the State of Israel, essentially over Jews worldwide, as opposed to just in a more limited sense.
Okay, so tell us now about the American Jewish Archives and how that sort of continues in this pattern or deviates.
Yeah. So the American Jewish Archives, as I mentioned, was established in 1947. So it's almost exactly the same time that the Jewish Historical General Archives are opening their doors. And these two archives, there's a number of ways in which they are such close parallels to each other. It's really uncanny. The term that you mentioned, omnitoriality, which I can say more about. It's a term that Jacob Rader Marcus, who was a professor of history at Hebrew Union College, who created the American Jewish Archives, he kind of made it up. And it was this idea that Jews survived because they were everywhere, right? Throughout history. And it's this kind of vision of the utility of diaspora throughout Jewish history, and is also in the 20th century as well. But he claimed that the term came from the Talmud, that it was a Talmudic term, right? The terminology of the kibbutz galuyot, which was the same exact, which was the term that the archivists in Jerusalem used, actually came from like the page before on the Talmud, right? In the Talmud. So there are like a whole bunch of really interesting ways in which these archives are connected with each other. Jacob Rader Marcus studied in Berlin in the 1920s to do his PhD, and he was in classes with Alex Bein, right, in Berlin. We can see this in their diaries. So there are these very intense ways in which these archives and these archivists are so closely interconnected with each other and often have a similar kind of vision, which is this notion of preserving the Jewish past and making it available in different ways. And so for Marcus, his creation of an American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati is a manifestation of his idea that American Jewry is the future in the aftermath of the Holocaust. Marcus himself was somewhat earlier a scholar of medieval Jewish history. He edited The Jew in the Medieval World, which is still a major source book that people use when they're constructing courses on medieval Jewish history, alongside many other ones. And Marcus, in the course of the time of the Second World War, increasingly came to believe that European Jewish history was over. And that American Jewry was where it's at. So by the time that you get to the mid-40s, he has basically dedicated himself entirely to the study of American Jewish history, and his creation of an archive dedicated to American Jewish history is a manifestation of his sense that one should study Jewish history as it was happening, as opposed to some kind of a post-mortem. And so for him, and he writes about this in the initial programmatic statement in the American Jewish Archives Journal, he talks about this idea to be able to film American Jewish history while it's taking place. And this metaphor is like, it's an apt metaphor because he's obsessed with microfilm. So he is interested in centralizing all of this material in Cincinnati at the Hebrew Union College, but he also understands that perhaps the best way to do this is to gather materials in duplicate. And so over the years, Marcus creates this archive of copies, essentially. And of course, there are a great many original materials in Cincinnati as well. But for Marcus, he has this idea also of the importance of diaspora. For him, it wasn't just about the utility of Jews being in different places and therefore being able to survive throughout the centuries, but also that it was useful to have things dispersed in different places. So in the context of the Cold War, he wrote extensively about the utility of storing archival materials off premises and having things in dispersed locations. He thought a lot, I think as a lot of people did at the time, about the possibility of a nuclear exchange. And so Marcus is creating kind of a centralized archive on the one hand, but an archive which is animated with certain ideas about dispersal and dispersion. And alongside this, he's also having a kind of a similar geographical project, as I might put it, as the archivists in Jerusalem. The Jerusalem archivists saw their archive as a representation of the hegemony of the state of Israel culturally over Jews around the world. And for Marcus, he has this idea of creating an archive that represents Jewish history throughout the Western Hemisphere. And so in the early 1950s and beyond, Marcus leads a number of archival trips to the Caribbean and to South America, where he goes to locations of very early Jewish communities in the 17th century and tries to gather as much material from these communities as he can. And this manifests itself in his broader scholarly work on American Jewish history, creates through his archive a certain sense of American Jewish history that's not just the United States, but that is beyond that as well. And this brings us back to the question of the epistemic things, which is that the way in which these archives are constructed create the possibility to study this history in different ways. So for Marcus to create the archive along his own vision of what is American Jewish history helped to sort of spread his particular conception of what American Jewish history was throughout the field of American Jewish history, broadly speaking, as it was growing and expanding in the 1950s and beyond.
So let's just pause and reflect. You've described three major archival projects over the course of the 20th century, each of which operates according to its own really ideological, guiding ideological logic. Each of which, in some sense, asserts a measure of primacy for the Jewish community in which it is itself situated. And this calls to mind Shimon Dubnov's system of revolving or shifting cultural centers for the Jewish people. In some ways, your three archives plays out or implements the Dubnovian vision of the evolution of Jewish history. But it's also the case that there are different practices at sort of the bottom-up level about how to actually do archival work. So in Jerusalem, there was a premium placed on, if not fetishization, about the original document, Whereas in Cincinnati, there was, in Marcus's vision, a complete openness to Xeroxed, microfilmed, copied versions of documents. It was the document itself, that the content of the document, not its form. And I want to now move our attention to the present and sort of ask how these kinds of divides over sort of what the task of the archivist was, what kind of material the archivist should be collecting, how the archivist should collect. How do those questions, which were so intense in the debates between archivists back and forth, Germany and Palestine, Israel and Cincinnati, the United States, what do these debates look like in the age of digitization? Has that just, in a certain sense, has digitization just kind of leveled the field and created a new standard for collection? Has it, in some sense, rendered the physical archive irrelevant? What does it look like in general, and then in terms of the Jewish archival project that you trace?
Yeah, so I think that to understand best the impact of digitization, it might be useful. I'll just say like a very, very brief word about some of the restitution struggles in the 1950s, which is that, and also beyond, where we see that that people are fighting over who's going to get the original copies, the originals of archives of Jews in places like Worms and Hamburg in Germany, also the Evo archives, which are sent to New York City in 1947, and various other archival caches. People are having these very intense debates over what should happen to these physical materials, and what ends up happening, right, is that with the rise of digitization, we can ask what difference does it make who has these original materials? To some extent, does that make the extensive court battles over restitution, does that make it a whole moot point, right? Because all of a sudden, you no longer have to fight over the originals. Potentially, you can just make high quality digital scans of them, right? So I think that there are major questions that we can consider here about to what extent does digitization change the name of the game when it comes to these questions of archival ownership. And I think that broadly speaking, that it's easy perhaps for people to look at digital technologies and think that they mitigate all sorts of problems and all sorts of issues, whatever they might happen to be. In the case of digitization of archives, well, perhaps digitizing materials makes it easier to access archives, right? Certainly in our COVID age, right, when it's much more difficult to travel and archives are closed constantly. When you look at an institution like the Leo Baeck Institute that has digitized its entire archive and made it available online, I mean, that's an amazing resource, right, that makes things accessible. And there are other instances of this as well. One can talk about the Israel State Archives attempt to digitize. There are a lot of criticisms to be had there as well. About that project, but it certainly, again, it makes it easier without flying to Jerusalem, right? To access certain kinds of materials. So there's certain ways in which digitization seems to make things easier. But actually, what I argue in the book is that what you see is that these visions of totality and of the ambition to collect everything are actually magnified by the digital capability. Because when you look at the archives like the Gesamtarchiv or the archive in Jerusalem, or even the American Jewish archives, there's always a certain kind of practical impossibility, right? They might speak about this vision of collecting everything, but everybody kind of understands that there's a limit to what you can do, right? But with the digital, I think that it masks it masks a lot of things, because it might appear that it mitigates these issues of ownership. It might appear limitless, but it's not true at all, right? And when you look at archival collecting in the digital, there's still a server where things are stored, right? There's still a choice, right, about what do you choose to digitize and at what level, right? You look at the Zionist archives in Jerusalem, for instance, where about 15 years ago or so, they were digitizing their materials. They digitized the Herzl archives at a significantly higher DPI, right? A significantly higher resolution than the other materials. And I mean, the Zionist archives, like the Zionist movement, has like an obsession with Theodor Herzl, right? And so you can understand why they would have done that to with their prized possession at the Zionist archives. But I think that again, like what we're seeing here is that the digital is like another way in which archives are an epistemic thing, right? That there is a choice about how do you make something into a historical source, a historical material that can be accessed, that can be studied. And so it's also something we haven't talked about too much here is the connection between archives and control, right? So on the one hand, digitization might seem to relinquish control and make things open and accessible, but actually it's another point of control and access where the archives are choosing what to make accessible, what not to. The archives in Jerusalem, the state archives, Israel state archives, somewhat controversially have blacked out parts of materials that theoretically for privacy reasons, but there are a lot of concerns that they are somehow censoring materials through this process as well. But I mean, again, we come back to this question of ownership, right? And so YIVO, for instance, just recently, at least theoretically, completed a project of digitizing materials which were discovered in Lithuania that were in Vilnius. And I say theoretically completed because I'm sure at some point in the future they will find something else to also digitize as well, right? Collecting is never really quite complete. But so their idea there has been to, the Edward Blank project, what they've called it, is to reconnect, to put back together the archives of YIVO that were brought to the United States after the Second World War with materials that remained in Lithuania, and to kind of reconstruct the quote unquote original archive. But part of what I'm thinking about as I think about digitization and digital archives is that the process of digitization, the process of what we would call a virtual collection, right? Virtual reunification. It's never really quite putting back the pieces together again as they once were. It's always a process of creating something new. And I think that applies to the idea of archives in general. But when you have this fantasy or this vision that you can put the pieces back together the way that they once were, that never really quite is the case. And this is part of the way in which I think about archives and archiving as a metaphor for modern Jewish history as a whole, which is that there are these attempts to try to put back together Jewish culture in various ways, but it always ends up in a new reconfiguration. And so part of what we see with these archives, both physical archives and also digital archives, is the way in which this constant impulse to gather together the materials of Jewish history is a response to the events that people are living through at the time, and sort of an impulse that goes beyond the scholarly idea of creating an archive, but that represents a broader set of issues in Jewish life, but that ultimately what we see with the archives, just as in Jewish life and culture more generally, when you put the pieces back together, right, they are in a new form. And so archives, like the constant construction of Jewish history itself, are not just about looking at the past, but also about reshaping it constantly.
Right.
In
So,
new ways.
Creating new forms or trying to put things back together don't seem to be inherently negative projects. And yet there is throughout the book a kind of undercurrent of criticism of the archival project. And with this, we're going to have to wrap up our conversation, I'm afraid. Some of the elements of the critique are the undemocratic nature of archives, which you referred to in your recent, just a minute ago, or the delusions of grandeur of archivists about totality, or the lack of awareness about the constructed nature of archives. And I wonder if you actually feel that ambivalence about archives, that at some point your critique leads one to suggest you might. Am I reading you correctly in sort of holding this kind of ambivalent posture toward the archive as and the necessary instrument or tool for the historian, which you yourself make ample use of, and the archive as the source of sort of elite power, delusions of grandeur, a lack of reflexivity about the scholarly project. What's your ultimate last word about the archive?
Yeah, so I think that when we look at the development of archival practice and archival activities over the course of the 20th century, within Jewish culture and also beyond, I think that archivists, have increasingly understood the active role that they play. I think if you were to ask a figure like Alex Bein, in the state of Israel, I think he would have an older view. I think, for instance, I, looked over his lecture notes, in the Israel State Archives when he taught the archival training course at the Hebrew University, right? And, it's very much like an older approach to archives that I think many archivists today have kind of moved away from, right? As you said, archivists themselves, I think, are more critical and more sort of self-aware today in terms of understanding the active role that archives and archivists have to play in the shaping of the historical record itself, as opposed to just storing it somewhere. Now, I think that, to kind of address your broader question about perhaps my ambivalence towards the archives, I can think of this in a few ways, right? I think that on the one hand, that we need to have an ambivalence to archives. I think that we should always look at archives and archival materials in a critical fashion. This is both, I think, important in a scholarly sense, right? But it's also important, I think, much more broadly for us to understand that the version of the past that we have access to has been filtered. It is what it is. It's what we work with, both as scholars and also, as members of the public at large. And I think that if we understand the power of archives, that it helps us to have a more sophisticated approach to understanding the past and also understanding how things get collected and preserved in the present. Because I think in many ways we should look at archives as, as I said at the beginning, very exciting places to do research, right? But also as these regimes of power and these places, that are actively shaping the kinds of histories that can get told in the very first place. And so I think that when we look at archives with a critical perspective, it helps us to understand things like Jewish history better. It also helps us to understand our own lives better because we understand the power of data in the 21st century, but it also helps us to understand the longer roots of these kinds of issues. I like to think about some of these Jewish archives as early examples of what archival scholars today are talking about as community-based archives, where you have minority groups, especially persecuted groups, taking control, taking ownership over their own history, right? And so much of that discussion, it relates to projects that have taken place in the past 10 or 20 years. And yet when you look at Jewish history, what you see here is an example about this idea of people taking control over their own history sort of goes much further back. And so we see archives on the one hand, to go back to something we mentioned earlier, archives as instruments of state power, but also the ways in which the archival process allows for certain groups, especially minority groups, to try to take control over their own history. And so when I think about what this book is about as a whole, I think that it's about the struggle by Jews to take control over their history and what that looks like in different places and in different times. And then once we understand that the archives are a product of this constant attempt for Jews to take hold of their history and to shape it in their own image, then it allows us to study and understand Jewish history in new ways, and it also allows us to understand history as a whole in a more nuanced and complex manner.
Well, the book is A Time to Gather, Archives in the Control of Jewish Culture. The author is Jason Lustig. Jason, thank you for a very rich and stimulating conversation. And I invite everybody to go out and buy the book to get more of the really exceptional texture that Jason brings to his study of the modern Jewish archival project. Thank you very much, Jason.
Thank you so much, David.